and thank you for joining Harvard W3D Women in Defense, Diplomacy, and Development for this much-needed conversation about women in leadership, national defense, foreign intelligence, and international security. My name is Tianwang Liu. I'm the co-vice president of W3D, and I'm pleased to moderate this discussion with the three distinguished women who, between the three of them, hold over 80 years of experience working in defense, security, and foreign affairs across the globe. Well, before we begin, we'd like to go over some housekeeping notes to be mindful of throughout the session. On the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button. Audience members will have the opportunity to ask questions towards the end of the program, so please feel free to use the chat box to input any questions you may have. You are also welcome to engage with the event's participants using the chat box, also located at the bottom of your screen. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be available to view after the event. We will share details with you on how to view the recording following the discussion. We'd also like to take a moment to announce that W3D has been working to produce our first ever digital publication called Thrill. The publication features forward-thinking storytelling from experts who work in the fields of defense, diplomacy, and development. More information about Thrill will be provided in the chat box. We welcome your engagement on the platform. Also, be sure you stay connected with W3D on social media at Harvard W3D and on our website at harvardw3d.com to stay up to date with upcoming events and workshops throughout the remainder of the year. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our president, Theo Skiadas, and our partnerships chair, Zena Adamu, for their support in making this event happen. Your support and participation is much appreciated. So, all right, let's get started. I'd like to introduce our three panelists, beginning with General Laurie Robinson. General Robinson is the first United States female four-star commander of combat forces and the first woman to command a unified combatant command. She retired in July 2018, following a 37-year military career, including commander of North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, and US Northern Command, NORSCOM. We will come back to this. Prior to her command of NORAD and NORSCOM, General Robinson was the commander of Pacific Air Forces and served in many other senior leadership positions. Earlier in her career, she commanded the Air Force's only airborne warning and control wing, AWACS, including combat units engaged in the Middle East. General Robinson has earned 2 master's degrees, served in a fellowship at the Brookings Institution, and is a senior fellow at the Belfer Center of Harvard Kennedy School. She was named as Time's 100 Most Influential People in 2016, and Time's First Women Leaders. She's married to Major General David Robinson, and they reside in St. Petersburg, Florida. General Robinson, thank you for joining us. So up next, I would like to introduce the Deputy Head of Division EU Situation Room for the European External Action Service, Evgenia Karatari. Ms. Karatari started her career in the EU 33 years ago, after having worked for the shipping industry in Greece. Her strong business development skills and a distinguished academic background have brought her to work for several world-renowned organizations, including the Council of the European Union, the European Environment Agency, and the General Consulate of Panama in Greece, and currently the European External Action Service. Ms. Karatari speaks Greek, English, French, and Spanish, and has a keen interest in EU's external relations and international affairs. Ms. Karateri, thank you for being here. And finally, we have Ms. Kimberly Jackson.
And thank you very much.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to have you. Finally, we have Ms. Kimberly Jackson, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Force Readiness at the United States Department of Defense. Prior to assuming this position, Ms. Jackson was an international and defense researcher at the RAND Corporation. She served in several civilian positions throughout the Department of Defense. And from 2004 to 2006, Ms. Jackson was the military legislative advisor to the US Senator Mark Dayton. Ms. Jackson served as a Naval Reserve officer until 2020. She holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Minnesota, as well as a Master of Public Policy and a Master of Public Health from the University of California, Berkeley. Ms. Jackson, it's really a pleasure to have you join us. So now we have some questions. For the benefit of the audience, our first question is about your most recently held positions. General Robinson, let's begin with you. We probably have seen NORAD and NORTHCOM in movies, but can you tell us in reality, since they are separate commands, what are the differences between them? And as the commander of both, how did you align their goals and missions?
That is actually a great question. I will tell you, it was, I understood NORAD because of my AWACS time, because I understood how we integrated with the Canadians, and I understood how to defend airspace and all of that. But I had never worked around NORTHCOM. And so I had to do a lot of learning about NORTHCOM. And if you look at what NORTHCOM's roles and responsibilities were, was to defend the United States against incoming ballistic missiles, to work with the interagency for different things such as wildfires and hurricanes. Those were things I dealt with, and do a lot of other things with different countries. NORAD is defending Canadian and US airspace. So one of the things I tell people when I talk about NORAD is, instead of looking at the globe with Canada here and the United States here, look at it from the Arctic and look at how absolutely close Russia is. We all talk about it vis-a-vis the Aleutians and down there, but I worried more what was happening at the top and how close they were. And so it was really important to get indications and warnings of what they might be doing, and working closely with being the commander of Canadian forces to defend both Canadian and US airspace. The other thing that I would tell you about wearing those two hats, in my NORTHCOM hat, I was responsible to the Secretary of Defense and the President of the United States. In my NORAD hat, I was responsible to the Secretary of Defense and the President of the United States, and the Chief of Canadian Defense Staff and the Prime Minister of Canada. So I had that dual responsibility in my NORAD hat. You align things if you think about defending, whether it's in the air, whether it's ballistic missiles, that's how you kind of keep those the same, but they're different. And so as long as you understood that and understood who you were responsible to and what authorities you had to do whichever job you were being able to do, that made it much more simple. The only last thing I'll say, and I'll keep my responses brief, two other things. Now, everybody thinks about the importance of your job. The most important job I had was in my NORAD hat, and it happened once a year, and it was NORAD Track Santa. I had to worry about where Santa was for 24 hours to make sure that if kids called, they could, know where he was, and parents could make sure they were in bed by 9 o'clock. The other thing I wanted to say is, it really is an honor to do this, and it's an honor to share the panel with my distinguished colleagues. I think that I love doing these because I learn probably more than I realize every time I start and I reflect upon it. So thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to sharing these moments.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing, General Robinson. So, Ms. Caratieri, I want to continue with you. As an experienced crisis response manager and analyst, what role do you and your team play in EU's strategic planning, and how do you achieve that?
Many thanks for having me with you tonight, and it's an honor and a pleasure to share this panel with distinguished participants. So the role of that my team plays, I call it a team of 10 duty officers and 2 other teams that are support teams. And we provide early warning and situational awareness on a 24/7 basis. So we work in shifts. It's the only 24/7 capability in the EU. So our eyes are open 24/7. We provide support to decision making, as our leaders need to know what happens when it happens. We ensure also continuous communication between Brussels and the European Union embassies abroad, as well as the common security and defense policy missions and operations. In order to fulfill our mandate, we keep abreast with worldwide events and developments. And we also contribute to the management of any given crisis by providing support to EU embassies and their staff, and to the evacuation of this staff and of European citizens when necessary. I give you 2 examples. Recently, we had a fighting in Sudan, so we had to evacuate both our staff and EU citizens. And during the COVID crisis, that was a huge operation. We contributed to the repatriation of around 600,000 European citizens.
That's really impressive. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Ms. Jackson, you currently advise one of the most senior level officials in the United States. Could you please tell us more about your main responsibilities and what an average day is like for you?
Absolutely. And just to reflect the thanks that my other panelists expressed, thank you so much for having me here. It's a real honor, and it's also just really fascinating for me to not only hear from my fellow panelists, but I'm really looking forward to the questions as well. So thank you for the opportunity. So as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Force Readiness, and of course, I always like to say that the longer the title, the less important you actually are. I essentially am in charge of the preparedness of the joint force in the US military to be able to do their jobs today, but also down the road, and to be able to articulate what the trade-offs are when we make a decision today on our ability to execute our strategy in the future. So it's a lot of qualitative assessments, it's some quantitative assessments. I will talk a little bit about what the typical day is, but I like to bin what I do in essentially 3 categories. I collaborate and work with my counterparts across the building, which is a huge building. I think that General Robinson might know off the top of her head, but it's something like in the Pentagon, 19,000 people work here. It's incredible. And we also work globally with the combatant commands that are not located anywhere near Washington, D.C., with the services and other organizations, both within the Department of Defense and outside of the Department of Defense. So I have to manage relationships with lots and lots of different counterparts to be able to achieve our collective missions, and also set the stage for my team to be able to grow those same types of relationships so that we can all collectively make progress on our efforts. Second thing that I do is I provide guidance to my team, and I provide advice to my senior leadership. So as you mentioned, I advise some of the senior most officials in the US government, of course, the Secretary of Defense. I work within the Office of the Secretary of Defense, which sounds like I'm one of 10 people in a small office. That is not the case. It's a very big organization. Of course, a lot of responsibility for the Secretary. So I provide advice on those preparedness for the joint force issues that I mentioned, but I also have a team of about 50 people that I provide guidance to all the time, whether it is to move forward on a certain policy, whether it is to double down on a particular relationship, for example, with the Joint Staff, or to reach out to U.S. Southern Command, or work more closely with NATO, or maybe it's a very individual decision on hiring somebody. And then the last thing that I do is I make decisions all day. And I raise that because it'll be a common theme in some of the other answers that I have, because I think that my fellow panelists will tell you that as you become more senior in your career and you take on more and more management and leadership responsibilities, the amount of decisions you make in a day increases dramatically. And oh my goodness, and this isn't just me, this is documented with no kidding empirical research, it is exhausting. So by the time you get to the end of the day and you have made decision after decision after decision, and you have to rely on your experience, your advisors who are on your own team, and your analytic skills, you go home and you're very, very, very tired. And it's something that you have to learn how to deal with so that your decisions made at the end of the day are not worse than the ones you made at the beginning of the day. So what does my typical day look like? I would say, I think like most people, it depends. It is a lot of desk work. I'm sitting here with at my desk, obviously, right now. It's a lot of emails. It's a lot of meetings. But sometimes it is I'm on my feet and I am running up to the Deputy Secretary's office. Sometimes I'm getting into a vehicle to go over to talk to Congress about some of the work that we're doing. But it is a lot of communicating every single day with my own team to make sure that they have what they need in order to execute all the responsibilities of the office.
Can I say one thing about decisions? Because Kimberly, I think that's awesome. Because by the time the decision gets to your desk, all the easy decisions have been made. I mean, so you're now making the hardest ones. So, you know, you articulated that so well. So that was awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. That's all incredible. Thank you for making the decisions. Yeah. So our second question is about challenges in your career and how you overcame them. For example, General Robinson, in NORAD and NORSCOM, you commanded 1,600 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, and civilians from the United States and Canada, and coordinated the activities of 300,000 National Guard forces. Could you please walk us through your journey as a woman leading a command of that magnitude?
Well, first of all, I tell everybody, it is such an honor and a privilege to command. The opportunity to be able to articulate things to higher leadership in order to ensure that your soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, Space Force, Guardians, Canadians, whichever are their civilian force, have the tools that they need in order to execute the National Command Authority's desires. I'd like to just say a quick, so I had no desire to be in the Air Force. My father was in the Air Force for 18 years. He asked if I wanted to go to the Air Force Academy. I said, no, I'm the oldest of 5. He said, okay, you're going to college, but you're going here to New Hampshire. And I thought I needed a job when I got out. So I joined ROTC because they wanted me to go to a 5th year for teaching and get a master's. And I'm like, I'm out. So I went in for only 4 years and 37 years later. I think the big thing, and it really trained me early on, was that when I grew up in the Air Force, I grew up in an all-male environment. I grew up in what we call our combat air forces, fighter pilots. You know, for all of you that watched Top Gun 1 and Top Gun 2, that it's just like that. And so, you know, I learned a lot about who you are, what you're doing, and the importance of being the very best you can be. So now I get to both Pacific Air Forces, which was 45,000 airmen, over 52% of the globe, you know, and in the NORAD and NORTHCOM with 2 bosses in one case. Here's Lori's a couple of ideas that I always think about. First of all, especially when you're in charge of a staff or whatever, you don't have to always be the smartest person in the room. In fact, I think it's really important that you sit back and you listen to the people that do down at different levels what they're saying, because they really know what they're talking about. And I'll give you one of my examples. In ballistic missile defense, there was an Army soldier. I called him Army Mike. And Army Mike was the guy I listened to when it came to ballistic missile defense. I took him to the Hill with me. I took him with the secretary with me. I didn't have to get in. I knew what my authorities were. I knew what timelines I dealt with, but I didn't, the ones and zeros, it wasn't me, that was Army Mike. I think you have to, as a leader in those kind of environments, I have to think you have to create the environment with which people want to talk to you. Everybody's going to want to tell you the good. Nobody's going to want to tell you the bad and the ugly. And if you're going to make a difference, you need to hear the bad and the ugly. And if you start at a briefing and you rip up the first page of the briefing and you start yelling at people, then the next thing you know, nobody's going to talk to you. Because if that's the way the boss is going to be, then we're not going to say a word. The other thing is, I learned, and it took me a while, the power of listening. Of sitting back and, no kidding, listen to what people say and not getting ready to retort or respond or formulate, you know, what we're going to do, because you've already decided what we're going to do. You're just kind of setting the room up to let them think they have an option to talk to you. But the no kidding power of listening. So no matter the size of the organization, no matter the size of your breadth of command or your breadth of what you're doing, those are a couple of things that I would tell you I learned over time that I tried to utilize and try to be successful, not for me, but for the institution of what I was representing, but also so I could provide the best military advice to my leadership.
Thank you so much for sharing, General Robinson. That's incredibly helpful for both leaders and us as well. So yeah, now let's turn to Ms. Caratieri. What are the challenges you faced in your crisis management work, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, very, very interesting question indeed. I would first, if you allow me, tell you that 16 years ago, I made a significant career move and chose to leave the domain of agriculture and fisheries in the Council of the European Union and join the security and defense domain of the EU. Be it before or now, one of the biggest challenges I have faced in my work in both environments was the multinational environment. 28 nationalities before, 27 after the Brexit, with different backgrounds, probably 1,000, now civilian, military, security forces. So in order to overcome them, I learned to be very open-minded, interested in other people's cultures, trying to learn from them, flexible, show empathy, while making sure at the same time that the work is done, mostly now that I have a managerial position. So this is rather a general remark I wanted to make. Now, in my core task about crisis management work, as my division functions as an information hub, often when an emergency strikes, we get either too much information or too little information. At the same time, we need to deal with disinformation and foreign interference and manipulation of information. So these are the main challenges in crisis management as such, for the type of work that I am called to do. We overcome those challenges by corroborating the information, by following the various narratives, for example, Kremlin's, and by closely keeping abreast with technological developments in the area of media monitoring and open source research. Then, other challenges that we face are unpredictable situations, And in order to face those unpredictable situations and respond in the best possible way, we try to be as best prepared as possible. In calm periods, organizing exercises and trying to be as prepared as possible. Last but not least, I would say the human reactions. Our work sometimes involves situations where human lives may be in difficult situations or under psychological pressure. And in these cases, our reaction should be rapid. We should have timely coordination with the various services, not only between our team and between the different members of other teams, but also with external interlocutors. And in order to be as efficient as possible in that sense, it is always important to have a clarity in the roles and responsibilities.
Thank you so much for sharing, Ms. Karatari. So now let's turn to Ms. Jackson. What challenges did you or do you face in providing analysis about the readiness of the joint force?
Sure, thank you so much. So I've just been inspired by my fellow panelists, so I'm going to try to bring together my answers with theirs a little bit. So I think about the challenges that I face. Again, I like, no surprise, I like lists and I like buckets and categorization here. I'm going to talk about challenges from an objective mission perspective, and then one specifically from a leadership perspective. So I would say that we face a lot of challenges in providing analysis about the readiness of the joint force, and specifically in what my office is trying to do and what the department is trying to do, which is to shift from focusing, when we say readiness, on the ability to get forces out the door to conduct war, to a much broader idea of what we mean by readiness. And we call it strategic readiness, because we know that it's a lot more than that. I already mentioned the time frame. It's not just the now, but it's over time. But we know that in order for our military to be able to do its job, we have to incorporate a whole lot more than just counting up how many people we have, how much stuff we have, if our people are trained, and if the stuff that we have works. But that has been the paradigm for a really long time. And so that gets into challenge number one, which is changing culture. That's often my very favorite thing to talk about. Organizations, very much including the United States Department of Defense, don't love change. This is very common, and I think a lot of you probably have studied that. It's very common. Organizations, when they go through change, go through the same stages of grief that individuals do, and we see that every day. It is very hard, I think, to ask people to speak truth to power, deliver bad news, particularly if leaders aren't open to that. And we're very fortunate that I think our senior leadership is right now. But adjusting that culture can be very difficult. And I think for humans, seeing ourselves transparently and saying, oh, we have a long way to go, we got some stuff we need to fix, can be really uncomfortable. But as humans and as organizations, that is very hard. So when we introduce new assessments and new tools and new definitions, ways of thinking about what it means to be ready, that can be, I think, a big challenge in providing that analysis. That leads to the second piece, which is, what does readiness mean? We love to use that word in the US government. Everything is a readiness issue. You know, my ability to go home and cook dinner is a readiness issue. Everything is readiness. And so you can't really make changes that you want to make unless you have agreed upon definitions of what is it exactly that you mean. So if you don't have a definition, then you can't create measures to understand whether or not you have or have not made any progress. So that is one thing that we're trying to attack. So the third thing from a mission perspective is readiness at its core is about the balance between supply and demand. So what I mean by that is we have missions that the United States military needs to work by, within, through its allies and partners to accomplish. That is the demand. There are a lot of things that our forces and our things need to be utilized to do. we have a limited supply. And by supply, of course, that's very much tied to resources and how much money we have. And it's not just money, it's the people we have to be able to do the jobs. And you can't just throw money at certain problems and then all of a sudden you have an experienced surgeon, right? And then all of a sudden you have medical readiness. You can't build it like that. So we always have more demand for a limited supply. From the leadership perspective, Ms. Karatari said that you have to balance empathy with making sure that the work is done. And so tying this to the broader theme of this panel, I think that to me as a leader, that is an acute challenge I face all of the time, because being an empathetic leader actually takes a lot of work. It's not natural. It's not just being nice. It is making sure that you are taking care of your people while at the same time pushing them, developing them, holding them accountable to ensure that the broader mission is accomplished. And I think that as a female leader, we are often held to a different standard of what that balance looks like, and we are perceived differently depending on how we approach that balance. That doesn't mean that we necessarily have to approach it any differently, but it is definitely something that time and again I certainly have experienced, both for myself, how I have been judged, and then also seeing how fellow female leaders are as well.
Thank you so much, Ms. Jackson. And time flies by fast. So we actually are more than half an hour in. We will open up our time to the audience question in 15 minutes. And Ms. Jackson's last point actually naturally lead to our next question. So all three of you entered into the defense sector at a time when women made up a very small portion of those who could enter. You not only entered, but successfully rose to the highest of positions to break barriers and serve in very high level and complex missions. What was the impetus for you wanting to join and remain in the field, despite all the challenges you knew awaited you? So for this one, let's begin with Ms. Karatari.
Thank you. So, my keen interest in international affairs, that back in 2007, when I joined my current service, were really emerging. My willingness also to support the EU in its role to become a global actor and to contribute to the promotion of its values in the world. As I said before, for me, joining the EU's external relations was a clear career choice after having spent 15 years in a different area. That required, of course, being retrained. I'm a lifelong learner, so that was not a problem for me, but it took certainly a lot of effort, a lot of personal involvement, I wouldn't use the word sacrifice because that would be too dramatic, because when we make choices, I guess that, it's because we want to do something. So I wouldn't use the word sacrifice, but it was really a new world for me. So I really invested in it and I don't regret it. I don't regret it at all. It has been very rewarding. And it is also very motivating to see that you contribute to something concrete. So I do have this feeling that I really contribute from my side, from my humble probably position. I'm not a big leader in the EU, but I manage to see the contribution of my work every day. So every time, for example, we have a successful operation, every time we manage to pass the necessary information to our leadership, it's extremely rewarding. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So yeah, next one, Ms. Jackson.
Sure, and I'm going to try very hard to keep this answer brief because I could actually talk about this for a long time, but I think a couple of things. The first is that I think it's important to note that I actually had no real plan to be first in defense, and secondly in this job. I did not grow up with, I mean, my grandfather served in World War II, but that was my only real tie to military issues. I had my parents have a foreign policy background-ish. So I was interested in the world, but I essentially, and I will keep this very short, I was going to be a sports journalist. I'm happy to expand on this at any point. I was going to be a sports journalist. I was working on the side in politics right after college. I met Ted Kennedy. He had a question about baseball. I answered it. He said, "You should be in my office." And I moved to Washington, D.C. And this was in 2004. And I was right out of college, and I was walking his dogs as an intern. And the foreign policy advisor to Senator Kennedy burst in and said, I wasn't walking the dogs at the time. That was confusing, Kimberly. Burst into the intern office and said, "Does anybody know anything about foreign policy?" And I thought, well, I wrote my college thesis on Cuba-US political relations and baseball as a diplomatic tool. And so I don't know where I got the guts to do it at 22 years old, but I raised my hand and I said, "Sure." And she said, "Come with me." And I ended up writing a book review for the senator. He had a meeting with somebody who had written a book. I think it was David Ignatius, if I'm not wrong, later that day, and I needed to summarize it quickly. And turns out I did well enough, and they said, "We're keeping her in the Foreign Policy and Armed Services Policy Office." And beginning of course, this was 2004. The U.S. had become involved in the war in Iraq, and the war became very, very real to me very quickly because I was in charge of casualty reports of Massachusetts citizens for the senator, and it opened up a whole world that I had never even begun to understand. And I realized very quickly that specifically National Guard and Reserve soldiers in Minnesota, who were National Guard soldiers were about to deploy, had no means of receiving mental health care when they returned, and no means to reintegrate into their home lives and with their families. And I became very interested in this concept of advocacy for a population that I had always just assumed had all of the money and all of the resources that they ever could need. And I was completely wrong. Anyway, fast forward, I went to graduate school, focused on military healthcare, and came back to the Pentagon on a fellowship, and immediately was placed in a policy office. This was 2009, focusing on special operations policy, which at the time there was a lot of interest because of what we were still doing in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And from there, I really found that I was so attracted to the mission, the quick pace, the need to take large amounts of information and distill them very quickly for senior-most leadership in the department and outside of the department. And I continued to do work in defense policy for several years. I eventually left for 6 hot months, decided that I was a failure at working in anything that was not directly related to defense, military, national security, and then went back to the RAND Corporation because I wanted the time to be able to think longer term and more strategically rather than responding very quickly, which is really the nature of this building many times. Spent 5 years doing that, and then was offered the opportunity to come back to the building and lead force readiness issues. I think that remaining in this field it's in some capacity, I'm always going to do it. And there, I think, are a number of ways you can serve. It doesn't have to be government service necessarily. But I think for me, it is, despite the challenges, and there are many, we work very hard. We obviously, I think we have all articulated some of the challenges here, and we haven't really even touched on the gender-related challenges that certainly are present. I can't imagine doing anything else with my life because I'm so deeply devoted to the men and women in the U.S. military and the men and women who support this type of work. So that to me, even though sometimes you do want to go home and quit and go about your second career, that is a great reason to stay.
Thank you so much for the amazing stories, and we really want more time to hear about that. And but now, General Robinson, would you like to share your experience?
Yeah, really quickly, I mentioned earlier I had no desire to go into the Air Force when I went in. My professor of aerospace science at my ROTC detachment said, Lori, get out of that career field. You'll never get promoted. Talk to your father, see if he can get you out. And I said, I'm never asking my father for any help. I'm gonna do this on my own. And so I went and I will tell you, I loved what I did, but I fell in love with what I did at Nellis Air Force Base, at the United States Air Force Fighter Weapons School. I was a student there and stayed on as an instructor. Every 3 months, we had, when I was a young captain, this was in the 80s, we had F-15s, F-16s, A-10s, F-111s, and F-4s, and us, weapons controllers. And we were the first non-fighter pilot group or squadron. And so not only did we have the challenge of being not fighter pilots, but I was the only female instructor. But I fell in love with the attitude. I fell in love with the desire to be the very best that you could be. I fell in love with going in and briefing a mission and doing the mission and debriefing the mission and looking at tapes and going to the bar on a Friday night and just being there, being a part of that team. I think the other thing, and so that passion of loving that job, you know, people can read my bio, but I just was blessed to have great mentors there and great friends there and great people that taught me about being, you know, what I did. I think one big lesson I learned there, and it did me well, it was a Friday afternoon and our one-star general was having all of us in to talk to us. And of course, none of us really wanted to be there. We wanted to be at the bar. He ended his call by saying, and all of you are part of something bigger than yourself. And so I was like, what is he talking about? I had no idea. But it was a few years later that I really realized that it wasn't about me. It was about the institution. And it was about service and focusing on mission and taking care of your people and their families. And making sure that you could either articulate the tools that they needed, go for, you know, to bat for them, as I've mentioned. So I fell in love with all of that. I will say this, as you heard, my husband was in the military. Also, they were going to at one point send him to Korea and me to Japan. And I said, well, honey, he was a fighter pilot. He was a Thunderbird pilot. I said, you're going to be a general officer. I'm an air battle manager. I'll get lucky if I get promoted, you know, to lieutenant colonel. And so I'll get out. And he said, and what would you do if you got out? And I said, I have no idea. He said, right. So he ends up going to the reserves and flying for the airlines. And so it was one of those things. Now I continued to progress. He progressed in the reserves. But it's those early times, you know, where I sat back and really earned a reputation and met a lot of people and sat back and learned to appreciate the institution. I think at the end of the day, if I was to sit back and tell you, what is it that gathers one thing to me when I think about why I stayed, was the absolute understanding that there's no higher responsibility and no greater privilege than raising your right hand and saying, I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, and being a part of something bigger than myself.
Thank you so much for sharing, General Robinson. Really inspiring. Honor to have you here. So yeah, as promised, it's 2:45, and before we open up the questions to the audience, before we move on to that, I'd like to, for each of you in 30 seconds or less, to please give advice to women in the audience who are seeking to begin a career in defense, and whoever wants to start is fine.
I'm happy to. I've got a good standard one. 30 seconds starts now. Find a white male mentor. I know that sounds really strange, but it's the advice that I always give. We are always, as women, predisposed to finding a female mentor, and my goodness, find a female role model, find female mentors, go for it. There are so many amazing ones out there. But the white male mentors are the ones who have the networks, they have the access, they can open doors for you that others can't. And we tend to shy away from that. But I would say ask for that. Ask for them to help you get that leg up, to introduce you to that other person, to get you in that room. That is what so many men are actually willing to do, and we do not ask enough.
Thank you. Thanks so much for sharing. I saw General Robinson, you're unmuted.
Okay, I'll go. So I would say a couple things. First of all, be true to you. When you look yourself in the mirror every day, and bureaucracy sucks, things suck, timelines suck, all that stuff, but be true to you. The second thing I would say is have fun. I sit back and I cannot believe it's been 4 years since I've retired. I can't believe it. 5, there you go. But have fun and enjoy what you do every day, despite everything else. And the last thing I would say, control the things you can control. I'm an anal type A overachiever, control freak, and my husband would tell you I'd love to control the entire world. And at some point I realized I actually couldn't. But control the things you can control. Be you, have fun, and control the things you can, and go for it.
Thank you. That's really inspiring, Ms. Kaitari.
Thank you. I fully endorse both ladies' aspirations, fully. If I can add a couple of things. For me, the advice would be love what you do. So choose something that you're sure that you will love. So only if you love it, you will succeed. Believe in yourself. Network. Don't be afraid to go back to studying, and feel equal. I say this feel equal with a flavor of gender balance. We have not that much talked about it. We all work still in men controlled environments, let's call it, probably. More and more, of course, we have women that go up in the hierarchy. In my service, we have very good initiatives at attempts, but for example, in the EU, still the number of women at managerial positions is inferior than men. So for me, it is important that women feel equal to men. This is not given. It has to do with the way we have been brought up, mostly women that we are of a certain age, let's say. Younger women now are more liberated from this gender, let's call it gender limitation. So for a tip that I have adopted myself, when I go in a room and I'm the only woman, because it still happens quite a lot, I just see myself equal with them. I don't see why I shouldn't feel like that. We may have different backgrounds. There might be, for example, high-ranked military officers, okay, but I have also my expertise, okay? So I bring in my expertise, I bring in my enthusiasm for their work, my willingness to help the colleagues, but I feel equal, and I feel equal. So
thank you
to everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you also you for the fascinating discussion and amazing advice. Now let's take some questions from the audience. We have a lively discussion in the chat. Ms. Caroline Gibson, I saw you have a question. Would you like to introduce yourself and ask the question?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists. It's really inspiring to hear your experiences and your insight. I work for the Ministry of Defence in the UK. And so I have two questions. One is, your experience with the sort of my second question, which you've touched on several times, which is what's your experience as a woman, and how that's changing in your environment. So, the defense environment being, to me, very unique in the sense of having a lot of opportunities for women actually that you don't actually see elsewhere, as well as some of the other things. So I'm just curious what your experience is. And then the other question I have is really around the global situation with the Ministry of Defense in the UK seeing very, very much more of a collaboration with the US than it has, even more than in the past, with AUKUS and with the Atlantic Declaration, and whether that's, I'm just curious whether we're seeing that with our UK, the US is doing some wonderful things here, or whether that's genuinely responded to and kind of understood from the other side of the Atlantic. So curious on that. Thank you.
I'll jump in real quick. So your second question, here's what I would say: from a military to military relationship, our relationship especially with the British Air Force has never been greater. That it's always been good, and it's been fun. I flew with them in Canada. I've flown with them overseas. When you serve side by side. So all this does is reinforce. And the other thing I would say, when I joined the military in 1982, and then retired in 2018. For women, when you open all their capabilities, all the jobs that you can do in the military to women, that's a huge change, right? When in the Air Force, when women could be fighter pilots, that was a huge change. I would tell you that, is there still work to be done? Absolutely. Nothing's ever going to be perfect. But the fact that we continue to look at, do we have it right? What do we need to make better? The only comment I kind of come to on this, and then I'll stop, is we do a great job of recruiting in the military. It's the retention part that's hard. So, to get and continue to have women at higher levels. But, everybody knows they're trying to work through some of those things, I know they're making opportunities to make that happen. And the fact that we're even talking about those things is 20 times better than it was, when I first entered. So is it perfect? No. Are we working on it? Yes. I think that's what's important.
And I would just say, of course, in the interest of getting to more questions as well, though they're two great questions, I would agree with everything that General Robinson just said. We enjoy thankfully, a very, very strong relationship with the Brits. I'm actually going to the UK in a couple of months to talk about strategic readiness and how we're approaching it, and learn more about how the UK is approaching it. We've already had some conversations. I think we have a lot of opportunity to be more thoughtful of how we incorporate each other's readiness into our own concept. In terms of experience of being a woman in this environment, I would agree wholeheartedly that we got a long way to go, but we have made a lot of progress, and you can even see that reflected in some of the positions that women hold. Combatant commanders, for example, on the military side, and our second most senior civilian in the department is an incredible and very strong woman, Dr. Kath Hicks. So, and those are just a couple of examples, and so I'm very encouraged by that as well.
Thank you very much.
If I may make a comment, it's not really a direct answer to your questions because, of course, the other participants are more qualified to answer to your questions. But I would like to share a concern that I have regarding female military officers that come to Brussels. You may know that in Brussels we have the European Union military staff, which is manned by member states, national experts that are in service. What really worries me is that women are quite rare that they come to Brussels. So the big majority are men. We did have some women sent by member states because European Union member states do have officers, do have female officers, but I don't see them that often in Brussels. I don't see that often. So I think that there is a lot of work to be done there as well. So the member states themselves to promote also this gender perspective. What we do at the same time, it's a very, very interesting initiative. There is an operation, if I can call it in quotation marks, to have a gender balance in the CSDP, Common Security and Defense Policy, mission and operations around the world. So there, I think that the work done is a lot better than the work done in Brussels. So just hopefully that this will be also taken care of. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we
Thank
only
you.
have 3 minutes left and probably time for one quick question. If there's no question from the audience, I have one. Like, as you mentioned, gender inequality and the gender ratio, how many meetings you attend that you are the only woman, and how did you make your voice being heard in the room?
I'll speak when I was a combatant commander every single time. I'll speak as, you know, the 4-star in the Air Force for Pacific Air Forces for a while. I didn't worry about speaking. I was there as the commander, and you know, sir, you needed to hear what I had to say, and so I didn't. I knew what I was going to say. And I guess the other big thing I always did is understand the positions in the room. What were people thinking? What were they would think about whatever topic? Not only so that I could know kind of what was going to happen, but I didn't spend a brain bite on it. It was my job, my role, my responsibility to present my position, my command's position, and do that articulately and rationally, pros, cons, risk, and suggested ways ahead.
Thank you, General Robinson.
If I may add a comment here, is that indeed we are we are called to deliver work, to deliver a service. So it's our responsibility to be there. And of course, yes, it is true that we may quite often be in meetings where only a few women are present, or we may even be the only one. What would help also is know who are the participants. That helps very much. So again, prepare for the meetings, be as prepared as possible, and have very clear positions and very, very clear proposals to make.
Wow. Thank you, Ms. Karatari.
That was very dramatic, wasn't it? Sorry. And I also realized I moved my camera earlier so you can have a perfect view of my cat printouts. Anyway, I'm all very new to the Zoom thing at work. So here's what I would say very quickly. I completely agree. I have the title, I have the experience. When I walk in, I don't worry about having my voice heard. I speak, I make sure that I'm prepared. When I was more junior in my career and I was working in the special operations environment, now I would say there are a lot of women that I tend to be in meetings with, and that is by virtue of there's a lot of women leaders and counterparts in the department. When I was more junior and working with that community, I was very frequently the only one. But I treated it the same way. I have a job to do. I have advice to provide. I have analysis to provide. What I would say is, so it's not that I'm trying to make space for my voice to be heard, but I am very conscious of making space for the women on my team, the women that I work with. If I even get a whiff of them being unnecessarily overshadowed, spoken over, et cetera, I'm always very mindful to be sure to turn to that female and ask specifically, what were your thoughts on that? What were you saying? Give credit where credit is due. So I'm always very conscious of the fact that not everybody has my booming voice and my title. So I want to make sure that I'm helping others to be heard as well.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson. So as we predicted, this hour flew by and we're out of time. General Laurie Robinson, Ms. Evgenia Karatari, and Ms. Kimberly Jackson, thank you for your time today. This was an absolutely extraordinary discussion. It's an honor to have you. And to those of you who joined us, thank you for supporting W3D. Until next time, hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks. Great job.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Great
you.
discussion. Many thanks.
Thank you for the wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
All right, amazing. Thank you guys
Yeah.
so much. That was absolutely incredible. We're so honored. Thank you so much. And that's it. Do you have anything you want to add or?
Oh, this was awesome. I do have one question actually, but first, you guys did such a great job. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I noticed that there are a few people who have reached out in the chat, either in direct
Mhm.
message or not. Is there a way to save that, or do I have to like cut and paste or?
Yes, there is a way to save the transcript. And so once we're done, let me stop recording now. Yeah, once I stop recording, the transcript will auto-populate and then I can just send it to you. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.